Right, so this morning we're looking at Leviticus chapter 4. And before we get to that passage, do a little review here just so we have the bigger picture that we're looking at. We have looked at the three main offerings listed here, first in the book of Leviticus, that you might say make up the core of the Israelites' worship. First, we have in chapter 1 was the burnt offering. Chapter 2 was the grain offering, sometimes called the meal offering. And then you have chapter 3, the peace offering. And those three different offerings symbolized, or at least pointed to, atonement. Then you have the gift offering, and then fellowship. So atonement, gift, and fellowship. And the picture that the Lord's giving us there is really of the central theme of the book of Leviticus. It starts right out there in the beginning, is how can sinful, rebellious man approach the all-holy God of the universe? We want to go over this again and again, every week, I think, just so that we don't lose sight of the fact that despite there being an awful lot of law and ritual and ceremonies here, it can get very tedious and somewhat confusing. It might pull us in the wrong direction if we're not careful. Though, if we look at it properly, it all points ultimately to Jesus Christ. The gospel is right here in the book of Leviticus, right at the foot, you might say, at the mountain of fire and thunder as it's beginning. Look at the pattern that's laid out there, right? You have atonement first, right? First, sin must be dealt with, first and foremost. It's what separates us from God, and it must be paid for. You cannot approach God without that. And then, after atonement is made, then the gift offering, right? It's a picture of the response that the believer has to what the Lord has done, both offering ourselves to him, right? Our lives and all that we have, and also a complete trust in the Lord. I think that's really the picture that you see in the grain offering, the thanks offering, that you say, Lord, I give you my entire life, all that I have, because I trust that you've already paid for my sin, and now I trust that you will take care of everything else in my life. It's a showing of that, and that's what the Israelites were called here to do as well. We look at and see what Christ has done on the cross, and that he will keep and sustain us. And then it's after this, and only after these things, that we have true fellowship with the Lord. And that's what Israel had as well, right? They first, their sin is taken care of, and then they give their thanks back to the Lord for what he's done, and then they can come to him with that fellowship offering and eat a meal with him. I think we want to keep those things in mind as we continue to do the study in this book. All right, so this morning it's going to be a little different in how I go and teach through this, and I hope I do well at it. It is a long passage, and it's a lot of repetition in it, and so I have decided we'll look at the entire chapter. We'll read it out here, the entire thing at once. And instead of going small section by small section, moving our way through, we want to look at the entire chapter as a whole and look at it, how it relates inward with it. All right, so starting there, Leviticus chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin which he has sinned, a young bull without blemish as a sin offering. He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord, lay his hands on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord. Then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tabernacle of meeting. The priest shall dip his fingers in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. And the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting. And he shall pour the remaining blood of the bull at the base of the altar of the burnt offering, which is at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. He shall take from it all the fat of the bull as the sin offering, the fat that covers the entrails, and all the fat which is on the entrails, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them by the flanks, and the fatty lobe attached to the liver above the kidneys he shall remove, as it was taken from the bull of the sacrifice of the peace offering, and the priest shall burn them on the altar of the burnt offering. But the bull's hide and all its flesh, with its head and legs, its entrails and offal, the whole bull shall be carried outside the camp to a clean place where the ashes are poured out, and burn it on wood with fire. Where the ashes are poured out, it shall be burned. Now, if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done something against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which should not be done, and are guilty, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, then the assembly shall offer a young bull for the sin, and bring it before the tabernacle of meeting. And the elders of the congregation shall lay their hands on the head of the bull before the Lord. Then the bull shall be killed before the Lord. The anointed priest shall bring some of the bull's blood to the tabernacle of meeting. Then the priest shall dip the finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil. And he shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar, which is before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting. And he shall pour the remaining blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. He shall take all the fat from it and burn it on the altar. And he shall do with the bull as he did with the bull as a sin offering. Thus he shall do with it. So the priest shall make atonement for them, and it shall be forgiven them. Then he shall carry the bull outside the camp and burn it as he burned the first bull. It is a sin offering for the assembly. When a ruler has sinned and done something unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord his God in anything which should not be done, and is guilty, or if his sin which he has committed comes to his knowledge, he shall bring as his offering a kid of the goats, a male without blemish, and he shall lay his hands on the head of the goat and kill it at the place where they killed the burnt offering before the Lord. It is a sin offering. The priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour its blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering. And he shall burn all its fat on the altar, like the fat of the sacrifice of the peace offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin, and it shall be forgiven him. If any of the common people sins unintentionally, by doing something against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and is guilty, or if his sin which he has committed comes to his knowledge, then he shall bring of his offering a kid of the goats, a female without blemish, for his sin which he has committed. And he shall lay his hands on the head of the sin offering, and kill the sin offering at the place of the burnt offering. Then the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour all the remaining blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove all its fat, as fat is removed from the sacrifice of the peace offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar for a sweet aroma to the Lord. So the priest shall make atonement for him, it shall be forgiven him. If he brings a lamb as his sin offering, he shall bring a female without blemish. Then he shall lay his hands on the head of the sin offering and kill it as a sin offering at the place where they kill the burnt offering. The priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour all the remaining blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove all its fat, and the fat of the lamb is removed from the sacrifice of the peace offering. Then the priest shall burn it on the altar according to the offerings made by fire to the Lord. So the priest shall make atonement for his sin that he has committed, and it shall be forgiven him. Well, here in chapter 4, we come to what some commentators call the first of the non-sweet savor offerings. The first of the 3 offerings were sweet savor offerings. And I like how McGee puts this. He says the first 3 point to the person of Christ, who he is in all of his glory. And then these next 2, the sin offering here in chapter 4 and the trespass offering in chapter 5, point to the work of Christ on the cross for sin. And this will be our theme here when we study these 2 offerings. The sin offering that we're looking at here is for sin as a nature. And the trespass offering is for sin as an act. We are all sinners, condemned for what we are and also for what we do. So just because your hands have not gotten around to doing the thing, you are still guilty. You are born guilty from the very beginning. In fact, you might say, we aren't sinners because we sin, but rather we sin because we are sinners by nature. I think that's the best way to look at these things. And there is a special emphasis, I think, to this truth here in our passage. Of the 5 offerings here that are described in the very beginning, this is the longest account given. The burnt offering takes up 17 verses. The grain offering was 16 verses. The peace offering is 17 verses. The trespass offering adds 2 more. It's 19. But here, the sin offering is 35 verses. So virtually twice as much. So the Lord spends a whole other amount of time, a doubling of the time, focusing on this as sin as a nature, right? The unintentional sin, the sin that you happen to do because that is just who you are. So I think this is we want to keep that in mind when we look here. It's the emphasis on that. Now, a few other things to note about this particular offering that stand out. It is the first time in Scripture that a sin offering is actually recorded. And in fact, it becomes the most important and significant offering from now on. And it is because of the giving of the law. Because now there was going to be a reckoning of man's offenses. Some of this is explained there in Romans. Turn to Romans 5. Romans 5:12 through 14. Therefore, just as though through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. Now, we could spend a whole week on just that passage, but don't mistake this. Paul is not saying there that before the law that people were not guilty of sin, right? When it says there that sin was not imputed when there was no law, the word there is for reckoning. It was not reckoned before then, because there was no law that they could specifically point to that they were breaking. However, that does not mean that sin wasn't, that they weren't guilty of sin. It just simply was, there was not a listing, a reckoning before then. Because obviously death came long before the law, and death is the wages of sin. So again, make no mistake, Paul is not teaching that things changed suddenly there. What it is that, what Paul's saying here is that all have sinned, but now that the law has come, it's only gotten worse for man. If you look down at verse 20, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. So you are now more guilty, if that were possible, because now the law has been given. This is how we should at least begin to look here at our passage back here, and this Paul's basically explaining the gospel here in chapter 5, or at least opening it up in how it relates to what we see here in man as a sinner by nature.
So, reckoning, you said list. Do you mean, because, once I became a sinner, all these sins started, made aware of my sin?
Yes.
Are you saying that the awareness of sin?
No, reckoning in, like, might say the forensic or the legal term, right? When we talk about justification and all of those different things, we speak of them, Paul at least speaks of them in legal terms, and so the reckoning is the listing out. That God has a list now of specific offenses that were a breaking of a specific law that was given. I think that's the best way to look at that.
Which also, when you look at that list, you go, I'm
Yes, you're every single one of those. That's what that is. Again, we could spend many weeks just talking about Romans 5. It is a difficult passage, but I wanted to point that out because it shows that that we are sinners by nature, and then the law comes and just simply makes it that much worse. That much worse. We're held in even greater accountability for our sins. Now, the offering that we're looking at here, this atonement, trespass offering, the sin offering. This offering was given at all the feasts. This is how important it becomes. It was offered at all of the feasts and offered on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, as it is called. It is the offering that the priest actually brought into the Holy of Holies. This was the blood that he would bring in and sprinkle on the mercy seat on that day. So this is even though it wasn't given until now, it does become the most important offering, again, pointing to Christ. Now, another thing to note about this offering is its contrast with the burnt offering, right? Both pointed to the need for sin to be dealt with, right? The burnt offering, you might say, pointed to Christ meeting the demands of God's high and holy standards. If you look at Ephesians, we understand this further. Ephesians 5, 1 and 2. Therefore, be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. That's how that ties back to those first three offerings of the sweet aromas. Notice there, though, in Ephesians, we are to be imitators of Christ and walk in love. And imitate him as how he lived his life. Again, this pointing to Christ's meeting God's demands and being holy, as he calls out, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." This offering was also a voluntary offering that ascended up to God. right? That's that first offering was that. It was a voluntary offering. That's what that pointed to. But our uh, our offering here, the sin offering that we're looking at now, this points to Christ as the propitiation for our sin. Jesus says of his death on the cross and the blood that he shed, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." This is when he's speaking in Matthew 26, instituting the Lord's Supper. His blood was poured out, like the blood is being poured out here in our offering. This is so. And unlike the burnt offering previously, this offering, the sin offering, this is a command. It's not voluntary like the ones before. This is the first time that an offering is commanded to be given. That's significant. That's significant. Now, there is also a great deal of importance that we want to see between the atonement and propitiation. Now, again, like everything, we could spend a whole month just on this topic alone. But I think to help us better understand what we're looking at here in our passage, we'll just look briefly at the difference between atonement and propitiation. And I think it's best and hopefully make things clear if we just look at the biblical definitions of those two words. Oftentimes they are seen as almost one and the same, and we do want to point out the differences. Atonement is to make amends or to restore a damaged relationship. It's the reconciliation of God and mankind, and specifically the reconciliation that is made through the death of Jesus. It is it's a making an amends or a restoration of a relationship in that way. Propitiation, while similar, it is a placation, but it is specific in that it is what turns away the wrath of God. It's a big difference there. And I think you can see from those definitions, one being the restoration of a relationship, and the other one turning away wrath. I think that you can see there why it is that today's church prefers to focus on Christ's atonement versus, well, they've all but forgotten the word propitiation. You almost never hear that, because it speaks of the wrath of God, and no one wants to hear that, I think, these days. And the fact that we need something to turn away that wrath, that is the thing to keep in mind there. And I think it is man's desperate need of a propitiatory sacrifice that is the focus here in Leviticus 4.
Quickly.
Yes.
First time I ever heard the word propitiation was from Bill Hybels, 30 years ago. But his definition was atonement.
Yes, that would not surprise me at all. They are different. They are different. And again, today's church doesn't like to hear about the wrath of God, so we've lost that word, sadly. So keep that in your vocabulary. Remember it well. It is of the utmost importance. Now, and we'll look at that a little bit more if we have time at the very end here. When we look at this, there are four distinct groups of people that this section addresses, or sins of those groups, you might say. The first is verses 3 through 12, speaks of the sins of the priests. Then verses 13 through 21 is the sins of the congregation. Then third, verses 22 through 26 is the sins of the rulers. Then verses 27 through 35 is the sins of the common man. And as we see at the beginning of each of these divisions, the emphasis is on unintentional sins, sins of ignorance, as the old King James puts it. There, verses 1 through 3 starts off. We read if a person sins unintentionally, and then if the priests also sins unintentionally, then verse 13, now if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, then verse 22, when a ruler has sinned and done something unintentionally, and then verse 27, if any one of the common people sins unintentionally. And I think we would want to see this the way that David sees this. Psalm 139, where he says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." David so understands that his very nature would cause him to sin in ways that he had no idea. And he wants the Lord to show him those things, to reveal them, to make them known to him so that he can ask for forgiveness from them and turn from those things. And that's, again, why I think also David says, my sin is ever before me, because he grows in the Lord and understands even more and more every single day how much of a sinner we really are, how much it permeates us. And I think that's every believer, as we grow, begins to understand that better and better. Or at least we should. If we don't, well, you might want to go back and look at your salvation and turn to the Lord about those things. If we believed this, we would completely do away with the psychiatrist's couch, wouldn't we? There would be no reason to go to the psychiatrist to get rid of our guilt, because we would know that we were guilty, and we would turn to the Lord over these things rather than there. Charlotte Elliott, who was the hymn writer for Just As I Am, wrote a small poem about this passage here of Psalm 139. She writes, "From human eyes 'tis better to conceal much that I suffer, much I hourly feel, but oh, this, though can tranquilize and heal, all is known to thee." You got that? She understood that whatever it is that you have going on in your life, the great comfort that we have is that the Lord knows all of those things. He knows all of those things, both the things that happen to us, but also the things that are within us. And despite the fact that we are ashamed of the sin that's in us, the Lord has dealt with those things, and what joy there is in that. Our problem is, as one of my favorite commentators, of course, McGee puts it, it is not that our mothers didn't give us all the love we should have had when we were little brats. Our problem is that we are sinners by nature. So consider that. So the sin here in our lists, the sin of the priest, is considered first. And as it should be, because he stood in the place of leadership. And just, I think, as the leaders of the church are to be held accountable, so were the priests as well. A priest who sins is a leader that is under a greater judgment, you might say. And when this priest would sin, he was to bring, as it says here in verse 3, a young bull without blemish. He brings the bull to the door of the tabernacle, and he does this, and he brings it in front of the veil, and he kills it there. And then he sprinkles some of the blood there at the veil, and then he goes inside and takes a little bit of the blood and puts it on the horns of the altar of incense. That was in the holy place. The altar of incense sat right before the Ark of the Covenant. He would put it on the horns there. And then he goes outside and he pours the rest of the blood at the base of the altar, the bronze altar. Now, the type of animal and where it's killed and where the blood is sprinkled, that differs depending on the particular position of the sinner, whether he was a priest, a ruler, it was the congregation, or the common man. Right? Those little details vary subtly. But all of them have something in common. The rest of the blood, the largest portion of the blood, is poured out on the ground at the base of the altar. And the picture that we see there is that dealing with sin is a very bloody business. Now, I looked up last time that the average bull had 6 to 7 gallons of blood in it. Calvin found out that there was almost 10 gallons, which is even bloodier than I had first thought of it. It made me think. I don't know who's done this, but I have done this. Accidentally spilled a 5-gallon bucket filled with water, and it felt like a main broke. Having to clean up that much water, I can't even imagine 2 whole buckets of that being poured out. That is a very, very large amount of blood, very significant.
I just have a question. I'm a little confused. So, unintended sin, who is responsible? Like, is everybody accountable to each other? Is this something that you're convicted by the Lord and you go to the priest? I'm a little confused how the process works. Is it not really clear how the process works?
Well, it doesn't lay out specifically the order of how that was to come about, but I think that we would understand it that a person would be convicted of their sin, or maybe their neighbor said, you did this, and the person, because it says when it's made known to them. So however that comes about, whenever they have that realization of sin, then they would come to the tabernacle with an offering. I don't think we would see a picture there like, say, for instance, the Catholic Church would make, in that you would have a confession booth and go to the priest or anything like that. I don't know. You would just come with your sacrifice. I have sinned. Here is my sacrifice.
I just was trying to figure out the process because it's hard for me to conceptualize how that actually works.
Yeah. No, I think that's what we can get from the text. There may be other texts later that might open up that further, but as far as what we have here, I think that that's about as far as we can go with that. Does that help?
No, that is
Okay, good. So a very, very bloody business that we have here dealing with that sin. Well, then next is the whole congregation's sin, and that has an offering. Individual sin is dealt with at the end of the chapter, but here we see that there is also a corporate responsibility for sin. God judges nations, right? And even those who don't participate in national sins can get caught up in God's judgment as well. I think this is also a warning to the churches. Because if your church has strayed from the truth and has become apostate and you stay, well, then you're also going to come under judgment. Look at Revelation 1 through 3. It warns of what happens corporately to a church. So I think that's what we see here. It's not that we don't also rightly point out individual sin, but there is a sense that there's a judgment and responsibility corporately. And again, here a bull is the payment, and it says that the elders place their hands on the head of the bull, just as the priest did before, and that, of course. Calvin was talking about what that points to, whether that is laying the sin on the bull, or if it's the pressing down of judgment, different aspects of that. But what is there is a personal responsibility there. The individual, the priest, and then the elders show themselves to have that responsibility, and then it is killed. And the blood is sprinkled the same, and then, of course, it is also poured out. Then, after that, we have the sins of the ruler. Now, he is to bring a young male goat without blemish. Now, that's not as costly as what the priest or the congregation needed to bring, but it is still very precious. A young male goat would have been a very precious thing, and it is to be killed next to the bronze altar. However, it's a little different than the first two. And then the blood is sprinkled on the horns of the bronze altar instead of in the holy place. No commentators really had much to say on the change there, but it's something to note. The ritual is the same for the common man, except that he brings a female goat or a female lamb. Again, less value than the rulers, but it's still precious. I think that the picture here is that we want to see kind of broader is that while a ruler is counted as separate from the common man, he's going to be held accountable for his own actions. And definitely because of his greater position, he has a greater responsibility. But he is also a sinner just like the common man, and his sin must be dealt with just the same. It's said that Sam Colt made man equal, but sin has done that in the eyes of God long before that. Well, there's one other thing that we've not looked at yet in regards to these sacrifices. Is there any comments yet? Anybody have any questions? Yes. What a ruler? It would have been the leader of a it would have been maybe one of the elders or a leader of a specific tribe. They would have just you wouldn't want to say royal families, but in a way eldermen. Or more modern term might be earl or something of that sort. That would maybe possess more land eventually.
In number 7, there are the offerings of the leaders of the different tribes, the leader of Issachar,
Yeah.
That you see there. So yeah, there were.
Yeah. Somehow there's delineations. There was more important people for however that came about. Maybe they were the eldest son of the longest line that could go back to the specific person. That might be.
So then, in relation to the church?
I would say that would be elders and pastors, I think, for sure. You would also maybe, there's not, you can't look at these things as one-to-ones, of course, but, the priest is also, yeah, it's very similar. Leaders in the church, maybe even, deacons and the whatnot as well. Yeah.
So, man, you have the congregation. What's the difference then with the common man?
Well, I think that you have that. There's the difference between that would be the congregation would be the corporate sin if the whole nation went off to do something, or they implemented some policy throughout the nation that was sinful. Then the whole of the nation would come under judgment and would have to offer up a sin offering for that. Whereas the common man, that was your own personal sin. Like you are guilty of doing this, and you need to bring a sacrifice for that. Again, here we're talking about the unintentionals. Well, the trespass offering, of course, deals with the more intentional, the active ones that are not necessarily the unintentional. But yes, it's again, that God doesn't leave out the personal responsibility. You get down to the end, you can point at all of the leaders. Oh, the leaders are the bad guys. We can do that all day long here. Look at Joe Biden and all the rest of them, and you go on down the list of all of our leaders, and then you could look at all the leaders of the churches, the priests and whatnot, and point out any one of them and wag your finger at them and whatnot, and then, but it really comes back down to your own personal sin. God doesn't forget about that at all. And every single one of these has the same offering. A blood sacrifice has to be made for those things. So now, the thing that we haven't looked at in regards to the sacrifices in great detail is that after the animal kills and its blood's poured out, all the fat of the animal is from its innards are taken out, and the kidneys for the priest's offering, and there's a little bit of vagueness in some of those details as exactly what's being pulled out and whatnot, but that's all to be burnt on the offering or the altar, right? The rest of the animal, what happens to that? The rest of the animal is taken outside the camp to the place where the ashes are poured out. Basically, you might call it the garbage heap outside of the camp, right? And that's where the rest is burned. It's burned over wood. Probably a large pyre would be made daily to take care of such a thing. And this, I think, this points, of course, to Christ. This points to Christ and his dealing with our sin outside the city walls. You remember that? He has to be, he has to go outside the city and have that. Basically, it's where God dealt with our sins out on the garbage heap outside of Jerusalem. We keep reading several times here. We heard and especially here at the last verse of our passage, the priest making atonement. And all of this brings us back to that contrast that we looked at earlier. The word there for that's being translated in some translations as atonement is kapar, which is obviously where we get Kippur for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And we know that as atonement. I think it's better translated as to make propitiation. If you go back and you look at all the different passages that shows up, it's actually best to be seen as to make a propitiation. And there is, again, way more to that word than we can discuss just here today. But the idea is a covering as well, a covering of sin. The mercy seat is seen as that, as a propitiation. I think even some places it's called that, the propitiation. So it's a covering. Christ is our propitiation because God's wrath was turned away because he dealt with it on that hill far away, right? When he poured out his wrath on his son. And now, what are we? We are covered by his blood and we're covered by his righteousness so that we are no longer seen as the guilty sinners that we are. When God looks down, when he looks down on us, he doesn't see us. He sees his son's blood and he sees his son's righteousness as that covering, that propitiation. That's why that's so important. It's one thing to make peace between two warring factions, right? That's the idea of the atonement. Make that peace between those two factions. There was a war, you make peace, you make atonement. There's one thing for that, and there's a whole nother world of being covered by Jesus' blood and his righteousness and turning away God's wrath. That is, and I think that is what I believe this chapter, and of course the next chapter, I think that's what this is dealing with. This is what that's all about. All that points to, that sin offering keeps pointing to that direction there. So consider those things as well when we're looking at them. Any thoughts or questions?
In this election, so many do see the religious aspect, or at least it seems to me, because the news just digs and hunts for a Republican who's in trouble, and they put up some pastor I've never heard of in the South who stole money, some Republican in Arizona who did this, but you never hear about the other side. And I just thought about Hebrews 5, which is what you're talking about. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf and make sacrifices, he can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. It's this same thing. If we recognize that everybody needs that turning away of God's wrath, we would be less likely, even at election time, to place it all on what kind of dirt can we find personally on some being on the other side.
You would see it on yourself as well. Yeah, and that, I think that's probably another powerful aspect of this passage here, pointing to that everyone from the priest down to the common man is guilty and needs that blood sacrifice. So you are right. I think we need to look at our own sin, and it would change a lot of things. Consider that. All right. Well, let's close in prayer.